too. I'm very happy to welcome our next panel. So, welcome to Dr. Brian Plasto, Biometrics Commissioner, and Karen McBride, Subject Matter Expert at the Scottish Biometrics Commission. So I refer members to paper 1, and I intend to allow about 40 minutes for this session. So can I invite Brian to make some opening remarks?
Thanks, Convener. And if I can start, as I always do, by saying it's a pleasure to appear before the Criminal Justice Committee, and obviously for the last time in this session of Parliament. As you mentioned, I'm joined today by Karen McBride. In the real world, Karen is a senior fingerprint examiner with the Scottish Police Authority Forensic Services, but she's seconded to my office until September 27 to help me with a couple of important reviews, one of which was laid in Parliament yesterday. If I can just go on public record by, I suppose, recording my appreciation to the committee, both members current and past, for the fantastic support that my function's had over the last 5 years, and also to say well done on getting through a truly significant programme of work, which is particularly legislative heavy. Members have already had the opportunity to see the written submission, so if I can maybe just pull out a couple of highlights from a few highlights. So the first thing is obviously just to remind committee members that the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner function has been in existence now for about 5 years. It's a low-cost function that works extensively in partnership, and we maintain oversight of biometric data used by 3 policing bodies, so Police Scotland, SP and the PIRC. In the last probably 3 years, we've laid 7 different reports in Parliament. 6 of these have been thematic assurance reviews, including the one on fingerprints that was laid yesterday. And we've also done a joint review on the laws of retention with Scottish Government. And sort of collectively over the period, we've made about 34 recommendations, mostly to Police Scotland, for improvement. We also maintain a statutory code of practice in Scotland, so the legislation that we operate under is backed up by powers of enforcement. And later in the summer, the first report that I will do in the next session of Parliament will be an outcomes report, which looks back at the previous 4-year strategic plan and provides some analysis to the Parliament on what all of this means in terms of better outcomes for the public, for data subjects and for policing as well. As mentioned, yesterday I laid a report in Parliament on fingerprints. This is the first time that fingerprints have been looked at in Scotland since the Scottish Fingerprint Inquiry was published in 2011. Members will remember that the Scottish Fingerprint Inquiry related to the misidentification of fingerprints in a murder in Scotland from 1997. And the inquiry led by Sir Anthony Campbell explored the reasons why that had happened and made 86 recommendations for improvement. And significantly, the cost of the Scottish Fingerprint Inquiry was £4.8 million. So I just use that as an example of what can happen when forensics go wrong. The good news from the fingerprints report laid yesterday is that all of the recommendations made in the Scottish Fingerprint Inquiry have been successfully discharged by the SPA Forensic Services, and as I highlight in the report, in my view, the SPA Forensic Services provide a world-leading forensic service to the criminal justice system in Scotland. However, as highlighted in the report, some of that good work's actually been undermined by Police Scotland custody staff who are failing to fingerprint thousands of people arrested each year when their own policy dictates that they should. And that obviously points to weaknesses in leadership and governance within Police Scotland's custody division. So I'm sure that the force will follow those recommendations up with some urgency. I suppose the last thing to touch on is there are some challenges ahead in the next session of Parliament. Perhaps unusually, I'm not coming to the committee saying that I need more money or more resources. I don't. But, you know, there are a couple of things on the horizon that may occupy the attention of the committee in the next session of Parliament. One of those being live facial recognition. So Police Scotland, as members will know, and the Scottish Police Authority are currently considering should they adopt live facial recognition in future. And this is against the context of the Home Office providing funding for live facial recognition for every police force in England and Wales, including UK-wide policing bodies that operate in Scotland, for example, British Transport Police, who already have live facial recognition. And then, I suppose the other question for me is, for the next Parliament to consider is, does it really make sense to restrict the functions of the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner to 3 policing bodies in Scotland when biometric data is shared extensively throughout the entire criminal justice ecosystem, including in prisons? And is there an opportunity to do something a bit smarter in that space? So I'm going to stop there, Convener, and yeah, we're very happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to open up straight to members just in the spirit of time. So I'm going to bring in Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. And I'll go straight to the fingerprint assurance review. Just to reflect some of the remarks you've made there, Dr. Plasto, so the Scottish forensic capability is world leading. It's clearly important we start with that, but you found that the police service only takes the prints of those charged, which is different from other parts of the United Kingdom. You said in your report that this could have significant consequences and might miss up to 12,000 prints in any given year. So can you explain to the committee why is this happening and what needs to change, and will it?
Yeah, so the reason it's happening, it's an interesting set of circumstances. The long-standing position in Scotland has always been if you are arrested by the police, you will have your fingerprints taken, you will have your photograph taken, and since the mid to late 1980s, you'll also have DNA taken. And that used to apply in Scotland regardless of whether you were arrested or whether you were detained. And then round about 2016 was a legislative change, and arrested people either became arrested as officially accused people or are arrested as not officially accused people. And for reasons known probably only to Police Scotland took a decision at that time that they would only fingerprint officially accused people. That never used to happen in Scotland. It doesn't happen anywhere else in the UK. It doesn't make any sense because the law, the Criminal Procedure Scotland Act, allows you to take biometric data from anybody who's been arrested. It makes sense to do so because, firstly, when you put someone who's been arrested onto the fingerprint machine, I'll just call it that, it's like a photocopier basically, within 20 seconds, if that person has been arrested anywhere in the UK before, within 20 seconds it will be able to confirm their identity, or it might say to you, see that guy that you put in cell number 1 that says he's Brian Plasto? He's not. So that's the first part. The second part is, if you don't take fingerprints from people that you have lawfully arrested, you cannot compare their fingerprints to prints lifted from unsolved crime scenes in the UK. And that obviously is now and in the future. So the second part, Liam, we've made a recommendation that Police Scotland should consider a take-all policy. In other words, they should go back to doing what used to happen in Scotland. That's a decision for Police Scotland. I'm sure they will. I'm probably quite confident that they will decide to do that.
Thank you. And on a related matter, which you found in your report, which is concerning, you highlighted bulk deletions, or an unauthorised practice, I think you might have called it, of bulk deletions when machines are rebooted, which you said, understandably, this could have a significant impact on victims and potentially the accused. You made recommendations. I think you made 10 recommendations in your report, but you made recommendations specifically around this practice. Can you tell the committee what are they directly related to this practice? And acknowledging that your report was only published yesterday, do you get any indication of whether those recommendations will be taken on board and acted upon?
Yeah, if I can answer the second part of that question first, which is, I haven't yet experienced an instance where a recommendation that I've made to Police Scotland or the SP has not been accepted and has not been progressed, some to completion, some that are still in progress. The issue there that we tap into is, we mentioned in the report that when there's certain mandatory information you must put into the fingerprint machine when you take someone's fingerprints. And as we mentioned in the report, that data then gets transmitted to the SPA Forensic Services. And the SPA Forensic Services are having to return 24% of all submissions, or they were at the time of our fieldwork, because of missing information, you know, maybe a missing date of birth, a wrong date of birth, etc., etc. All of that creates churn in the system. When we visited a custody centre in a city in Scotland, at the time of our visit, there were 3 prisoners in custody, three arrested people, but there were 202 live cases on the machine. In other words, cases which have incomplete or missing information. And what we think is happening is that there's an upper threshold on the machines. They can maybe only hold 1,300, 1,500 open cases. And what we think has happened is sometimes when that threshold has been breached, the machine then hangs and it isn't available for people to use. And so it would appear that sometimes the machine has effectively been turned on and back off again, and that has resulted in the deletion of data. Now, will be an opportunity to bring Karen in, I'm sure, but you know, Karen's seen the other side of that, where as a senior fingerprint examiner, she's received a request from the Procurator Fiscal to go and look at a set of prints, the arrest prints, only to go in and find that they're not there because they've been deleted. So, you know, that practice of deleting data is not authorised Police Scotland practice. That's a substantive point. So the recommendation that we've made, we have asked for the ability to delete records, because there are legitimate reasons where you might want to delete a record, is restricted to supervisory staff. At the moment, anybody who's a trained live scan operator can do that. So that's the issue. The recommendation will be accepted. The recommendation will be progressed. No doubt about that whatsoever.
I understand. Thank you. Convener.
Ollie McNeill, followed by Sharon Dowie.
Thank you. Good morning. Yeah, your key highlight in your report was well trailed in the press. I think it was really useful. I think people were quite shocked, to be honest, that this wasn't happening. Do you not think it should have occurred to somebody in Police Scotland that, from what you're saying, it's quite detrimental procedure not to be in place when it comes to solving crime?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we were, or sorry, I can't speak for Karen. I was as shocked as you were, Pauline, to see the level of missed fingerprint opportunities. You know, I mean, upwards of 12,000 in a year is it's just not acceptable, and it needs to change. So, yes, that was not completely unknown to Police Scotland. They knew about the problem, so that's why I said in my opening remarks, you know, that this is an issue of leadership and it's an issue of governance. So, Police Scotland does have a biometrics oversight board chaired by an assistant chief constable. They also have a head of biometrics. But the problem is that the biometrics span the portfolios of every single assistant chief constable in Scotland. And in this case, in the case of fingerprints, the problems, if you want to call them that, are lying fairly and squarely within the Criminal Justice Services Division. So it's Criminal Justice Services Division who need to put their house in order yeah, just make sure that this situation improves and improves quickly.
Thank you very much. Karen, I wanted to ask you about the use of fingerprints these days in court. I don't know when it was, but I did actually chair the parliamentary inquiry into the Shirley McKee case, which kind of cast, let's say, some question marks over the use of fingerprints following that case, which was a long time ago. But can you tell the committee how widely used are fingerprints now compared to DNA, or what's the balance?
The fingerprints actually can be used alongside. They don't always provide the same outcome. So the fingerprints can sit completely separately from DNA. So when cases come in, it might be that the fingerprints are more pertinent because they're specifically related to a certain item or like drugs packaging or something where the fingerprints have a different type of relevance. So a DNA hit might provide the court with one amount of information, whereas the fingerprints could provide something else. And that's where, to just connect back with what Brian was saying, there are times if fingerprints haven't then had a charge set taken, then we wouldn't be able to prepare a report for court, even though there had been an identification for that person on a legally held set of prints on the system. So I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding as well that if someone has fingerprints held, that they don't need to then go and take any more fingerprints. Whereas currently, for producing court reports, you do have to have a charged set of prints so as not to disclose any previous convictions. In terms of how many, I don't have a statistic of how many DNA reports compared to fingerprint reports. There are a regular occurrence in the fingerprint unit to be requested court reports. They sometimes come in with a standard forensic instruction where we're instructed to compare a named person who has been charged. Other times it would be a search of scene of crime marks through the database, which then hits on someone, and then they will go and detain that person, and if they decide to charge them, then we would be asked to prepare a court report. And we don't give evidence all the time. A lot of the time our evidence is accepted. However, we do produce many court reports, joint reports, with detailed findings of the outcomes of all the marks in the case and whether they were identified or compared negative, whatever.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. Sharon Dowie.
In your submission, you've got that the Scottish Government has no vision for where Police Scotland should be with biometric data and technologies because there's no long-term strategy in place. And you've also said that there's a potential need to expand the Commissioner's remit to create a public safety camera code of practice for Scotland due to lack of coherent strategy to monitor public surveillance systems. So does Scotland require a more comprehensive national biometric strategy?
Yeah, thanks for it. Because my opinion is yes. So, you know, in my submission, I kind of illustrate the point about in England and Wales, the Home Office has a biometric strategy, and they support that strategy with significant funding. So, for example, upgrading the UK DNA database, upgrading the UK fingerprint database, updating the UK custody image database with a strategic facial matcher capability. The Home Office also funds the Police Digital Service, which looks at the whole digitisation piece. They are also have announced funding for a new Police National AI Centre, and you know, whether you agree with it or not, they have provided funding for an additional 50 live facial recognition vans to make that capability available to every police force in England and Wales. So if you look at Scotland, Scotland doesn't have a government-led biometric strategy. Scotland has a strategy on public space safety cameras that's so old that it's still known as a CCTV strategy. So I just think there's an opportunity for the government to set out, or the next government to set out, what they do want to do in this space, what they don't want to do in this space, and there are opportunities to do more with this function, including, I just think it would be a really good idea to have a public safety camera code of practice for Scotland, given the inexorable rise of artificial intelligence and the application of that to public space safety cameras.
Is that something that we could work with the Home Office on, so that we've got a system that works for the whole of the UK? I'm just thinking, because obviously crime doesn't have any borders, so is that something that we should work on, or do we need our own Scottish system?
My experience is Scotland working with the UK on certain things can be very difficult. So a good example is in 2021, when I took up this role, a civil service team were trying to pursue a Section 104 order under the Scotland Act to bring National Crime Agency, British Transport, Police, Ministry of Defence, Police in relation to their Scottish operations under my jurisdiction, or rather the jurisdiction of the Code of Practice. I invested a lot of time and energy speaking to the chief officer teams of those UK-wide bodies. They were all agreeable, but then here we are in 2026 and it's just never happened. And that's did not happen with the last UK government, and it hasn't got any traction with the current UK government. So it's not a party political issue, it's just an issue of sometimes Scotland and the UK see things differently, I think.
Would it be beneficial if we worked together? I'm just thinking...
Yes, it would be beneficial.
For the benefit of
yes,
everybody.
because, look, I know I've probably bored the committee with this statement before, but it doesn't matter if you're arrested in the Shetland Islands or the Scilly Isles, your data, you know, whether it be fingerprints, DNA or your image, ends up in the same UK databases. So, yes, absolutely makes sense. Yeah.
It's beneficial if you get a system that everybody can get access to, so the information crosses borders. Right, okay, thank you.
Okay. I wonder if I can just pick up on a point that you raised in your opening statement, Brian, and that was with regard to extending your remit to the wider justice system, and that seems to make sense given the use of biometric data beyond just Police Scotland. And you spoke about prisons in particular, and the rationale for including prisons is because in your submission you set out because biometric data are acquired from prisoners without consent, including those on remand under domestic legislation devolved to the Scottish Parliament. And one interesting point that you also include is with regard to the positive use of biometric data in terms of supporting things like easing the prison population. So I wonder, I was very interested in that proposal. I'm just wondering if you can maybe set out a wee bit more about that.
Yeah, so on the broader point, firstly, about prisons was that, you know, I think originally when this function was created, when the bill originally went through the Parliament, I think the original thinking was, you know, to restrict the functions to Police Scotland, the Scottish Police Authority and the Park, basically because in one way or another they all deal with data that's been taken from people without their consent, either because they've been arrested or because they've been a victim of crime. But if you extend that rationale, or you think, well, you know, biometric data gets taken from people in prisons under devolved Scottish powers, under legislation set by this Parliament. So it's an extension of the same logic. The preventative part that I reference in my submission is something which is known as e-carceration technologies that are increasingly being used around the world to keep people out of prisons or to manage offenders in the community. So, you know, members will be aware of, you know, the sort of old-fashioned technology, the ankle tags, but there's far more sophisticated technology now where, you know, people who have offended can be kept out of prison, who can be set a requirement to biometrically log on to their smartphone, you know, through their fingerprint or voice, face recognition. There are also skin monitoring devices, you know, so people who maybe have an offending history connected with alcohol abuse or drug abuse, where there are biometric wearables which can send, every 30 minutes a reading to the monitoring centre to make sure that people are complying with their conditions. So, I suppose the point I'm trying to make is that biometrics can be a real force for good. It can help to keep people out of prisons in a controlled way at a time when, the prisons, not just in Scotland but across the UK, are at capacity. So that's the context. But of course, the bit about all of that is that if you're not at the table because prisons are not part of your remit, then you're not available to give that kind of advice and suggestion.
So is that something then that you'll perhaps include in your outcomes report that you mentioned that you'll be laying later on this year?
Yeah, so that's a good question, Keena. There's a two-part thing here. One is that the Scottish Government are currently doing a statutory review of our functions. So built into the Scottish Biometrics Commissioners Act was a requirement for Scottish Government no later than 1 year after the expiry of the first strategic plan. In other words, by late November of this year, the Government have to lay a report in Parliament setting out the Government view on whether the Commissioner's powers or functions should be increased, reduced, etc., etc. So that's a Government responsibility, and I've fed my views on all of that to the Government team that are doing that. Quite separately, as I mentioned, we're going to lay an outcomes report in Parliament. We hope to do that before the summer recess, which specifically looks back at the first strategic plan, so the 4 years from 2021 up till the 30th of November 2025, and to look back at all of our activity around the code of practice, around compliance assessments on the code, around these 6 different it'll be 5 thematic assurance reviews because the fingerprints one is in the current plan, and our joint work with Scottish Government, and to include some qualitative and quantitative data to highlight to the Parliament what does all this mean and what outcomes has that achieved in terms of either better outcomes for data subjects, better outcomes for policing, and in terms of public confidence. And on that last point, it's just worth saying that in 2021 we ran a public attitude survey. It was done for us by ScotSen. We repeated that in 2025. That one was done by the DIFLI partnership as part of the Scottish Police Authority annual public confidence and policing survey, and we're doing it again. In fact, it's been done already for 2026. We've not had the results yet, but we should get these in the next 2 weeks. So all of that will be wrapped up into that outcomes report, and we will again, as I will keep doing, I'll reiterate where I see further opportunities in this space.
Okay, thank you. And just finally from me, again in your submission, you make reference to, I suppose, work underway within Police Scotland with regard to the rollout of live facial recognition. And I think you say that Scotland may be, or according to the chair of the SPA Policing Performance Committee, Scotland may be 18 to 24 months away from a business case on live facial recognition being presented to the authority. Just interested in your views on that, and perhaps what your role will be within the work ongoing to develop the capability in live facial recognition.
So, I suppose the first thing to say is that, and this probably taps into a question that Pauline asked of Karen earlier on, which is DNA and fingerprints helps to solve about 1 in every 200 crimes in Scotland. I get quite nervous when I hear chief officers in the UK saying things like facial recognition is going to revolutionise policing. It's not, and we know that because the Metropolitan Police, when they have deployed live facial recognition, after doing so for a year and a half, they announced that they had made 1,000 arrests through live facial recognition deployments. But as part of that announcement, they explained that to achieve those 1,000 arrests, they had to scan 1.9 million faces. So, that tells you that to achieve a single arrest, you need to scan 1,900 faces. So, whilst it is a valuable policing tool in particular circumstances, it isn't as valuable a policing tool as DNA and fingerprints. So you can understand why Police Scotland and the SP are looking at this, because there's a national rollout in the rest of the UK. My position on live facial recognition is that I think it could add value to policing in a limited and specific set of circumstances. But the difficulty for Police Scotland will be, if they decide to do this, will be how to do it in a way that complies with the Scottish Code of Practice. Because if they were to deploy it in a set of circumstances where the same objective could have been met through conventional policing techniques, then that would not meet the high bar of the Scottish Code of Practice. So that's a clumsy way of me saying to you that it is not by accident that Police Scotland, or that Scotland is the only part of the United Kingdom that currently doesn't have live facial recognition. Part of the reason we don't have it yet is because we have a statutory code of practice in Scotland which sets quite a high bar around how biometrics may be used. And significantly, my opposite number in England and Wales, the Biometrics and Surveillance Camera Commissioner, his statutory powers under the Protection of Freedom Act 2012 only relate to DNA and fingerprints. He has no locus in how the police use facial technologies, and that helps you to understand why there's been some, particularly in the early days, some unregulated experimentation in this space. So, yeah, I'm not totally opposed to the concept, but it would depend on under what circumstances Police Scotland would propose to use it.
Okay, thank you. I've got a couple of members wanting to come in. I will have to ask you to be very, very brief because we've still got some agenda items to cover. So Jamie, Hackburn, then Katie.
Yeah, I mean, I will be brief because this would require a substantial conversation, and it is on the issue of live facial recognition. I mean, it does, I suppose, the opening question, I'll ask it all together, would be, do you recognise it does raise some ethical questions, ethical considerations? You know, you'd be talking about an adjunct of the state with powers of arrest, scanning, I think you said Metropolitan Police scanned 1.9 million faces. There are obviously issues involved. You did use the term that, you know, there should be a limited and specific set of circumstances that this could be deployed. So it would just be useful just to get some insight as to what you mean by that. And you know, do you think, does the Statute Code of Practice cover the sort of specific legal framework that would be required, or do you think it would be incumbent on Parliament? Clearly Parliament can take an interest in whatever it wants to in terms of reviewing matters, but do you think Parliament would have to consider whether this required further considerations in terms of a legal framework?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. It's probably useful to start by acknowledging that obviously this is a highly controversial policing tool that raises a number of ethical considerations. It's probably worth pointing out at the same time, you can't walk into a major supermarket in Scotland and use the self-checkout without your face being scanned. And
although you can choose not to go into that supermarket.
Exactly. And that's the point I was about to make. So the existence of a legal framework in Scotland around biometrics relates to either you've had your biometric data taken by the police because you've been arrested, or you've had it taken by the police because you've been a victim of crime, for example. But live facial recognition is something completely different, isn't it? So it's an entirely different use. Where I think it could be useful is as part of a strategic policing response to violence against women and girls. I think if other circumstances, county lines, drug dealing would be one. And the other one that I always like to sort of say to people is, you know, if we were ever to experience an event, something like the Manchester Arena bombing, in circumstances where there was advance intelligence about a known individual attending an event in crowded public space or private space, and Police Scotland were not able to prevent that from happening because they had been denied access to a particular technology that could have prevented it from happening, then the Parliament would rightly ask questions of Police Scotland about, well, why did you not use that technology? It's there, you know. So it is a difficult one. It's one that raises lots of ethical considerations. On legislation, I think there are two options here. One is the Scottish Biometrics Commissioners Act, the sections relative to the Code of Practice, state that the Commissioner, in the preparation of a Code of Practice, can create provisions for different purposes. So, in other words, the current Code of Practice, which we intend amending later this year, and I should say that when we amend the Code of Practice, it has to come back through the ministerial and the parliamentary route, so that it's exposed to the full scrutiny of Parliament. Now, we are proposing to amend it at the moment to update some UK legislative changes around new, change from Data Protection Act to Data Use and Access Act, etc. But there is a potential opportunity to include either an appendix or a specific provision in the code that would set out the criteria or suggested criteria under which this sort of technology could be used in future, and then to expose that to ministerial and parliamentary debate. So that's one route.
You say debate, though. Would it have to be agreed?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it has to be.
Do you know the process? Is it?
Yes. So
sorry, you will know the process. Yeah, what is the process?
Yeah, absolutely.
If you could maybe write to us just to set that out. Absolutely. I'm just very conscious of the time. I'm really sorry to interject. I never like to do that, but if I can just make that request in order that... Sorry, apologies, Jamie Hepburn. And I'll very quickly bring in Katie Clark.
Again, I was going to raise the issues about facial recognition, and it may well be that the response could be made in writing as part. The point, Sheila, I was going to make was the concerns and the controversy round about facial recognition, particularly in relation to racial bias and racial discrimination, but also misidentification. We know that already there's extensive use of drones, for example, at protests now in Scotland. So it would be helpful, perhaps in writing, to get a response that addresses some of these issues, because I have absolutely no doubt that you're aware of some of the concerns and the international controversy around about some of this technology. So perhaps something in writing might be helpful.
Yeah, very happy to do that. And just one very brief point on that is I'm not sure if members are aware, but Police Scotland a few months ago stopped using the retrospective facial search functionality within the UK Police National Database, and that was something they did voluntarily after the National Physical Laboratory found that the algorithm contains statistically significant demographic bias. So Police Scotland are the only police force in the UK who have discontinued the use of that software. I'll include that in my written.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, and apologies for cutting